My name is Ben. If you're sitting way in the back, this reminds me of teaching statistics where nobody likes to be up front, so I would encourage you all to move up front. I've got some good graphics to show you, some statewide maps, so if you've got any difficulty seeing a screen at all, I would encourage you to move forward. Seeing none, I will move on. Okay, I need to do one thing here quick, which is start recording the video or sharing. There we go, sharing a video up there. And for those of you on the UNL Connect, can you hear me through your computer? Yes? Okay, I think we're good to go. So, there are two polls here. If you want to take just a minute and answer those two questions there, I'd be happy to not give you the answers right now, but we can do it during the course of the presentation. So my name is Ben Winchester. I'm the Research Fellow, which is a very generic kind of title at the University of Minnesota Extension, and I'm within the Center for Community Vitality. So I'm very encouraged to hear the conversations you're having here in terms of trying to move communities forward in vital ways. My undergraduate degree is in math and statistics. I'm a data geek. I love data, but I know most people don't. So my graduate degree was in rural sociology. I went to the University of Missouri, studied under Darrell Hobbs, Rex Campbell, Ken Pigg. So in terms of doing leadership and kind of data work, I feel well versed. I began my work working for the Center for Small Towns at the Morris campus and have recently moved to Extension, well, recently 7 years ago or so. So I've been doing rural studies in between Minnesota and Missouri for about 16 years now. So I would consider myself a young researcher in the rural development industry. So with that, we're going to close the polls somewhat. They'll still be open, but I don't think you're going to be able to see them. And there we go. Okay, I'm very excited by this. So I want to talk about the rural narrative. I want to talk about how we talk about our rural communities, how we examine our rural communities, what we use in our grant applications, what we use when we tell our communities what to expect for the future. When I first started in the field, I saw these. A big disclaimer here, this is usually a good hour-and-a-half to 2-hour presentation. I'm packing into 45 minutes. So I may fast forward through some slides, I may gloss some things over a little bit, but if there will be time for follow-up questions, that Randy and Phyllis will be facilitating after this. And if you've got any questions about anything I say, I have a citation behind everything. So make a note. You can email me, call me. I'm more than happy to answer your questions. So with that, again, as a younger researcher in the field, these were pretty much the taglines I heard. The kids are all leaving. We've got this out-migration issue. Nobody wants to move to our rural communities. There's a brain drain. For those of you that know the term brain drain, it's inappropriately used, but it means when you lose your high school kids and they leave your small towns. A small aside, the term brain drain, from an international perspective, means losing your PhD doctors, your scientists, and your engineers. So for some reason, the rural development industry has decided to use this term to describe the loss of our high school kids, which, you know, don't have a lot of experience, have a high school degree, and a lot of potential. So I would like to correct the use of that term by giving you some additional language around this migration. And the other thing is just rural areas are dying. They're bleeding, one of our legislators said in Minnesota at a conference we hosted, that rural areas were just bleeding the state dry. So it's really a deficit approach. I know a lot of you are familiar with ABCD or the asset-based community development work. And this, you know, this whole type of language that we use runs counter to everything I learned in my community development training. So I would like to present to you what may appear to be a science fiction view of our rural community, but it is dead true. And again, it's kind of the whole, when I'm getting into the industry, is there nothing but storm clouds ahead for small towns? But what we do know is there have been changes. There have been changes that have occurred across our rural countryside. The early part of the 20th century, we started to see, you know, we had small towns really populated every 8 to 12 miles, and that was there to help get agricultural products to the railway, which then brought it for us in Minnesota down to Kansas City or to Chicago or Minneapolis to the grain exchanges and different places. So our towns were placed initially based on railways. But the rise of vehicles changed a lot in terms of how towns were connected to one another and really the functional purpose of each small town. So when you could get, I mean, this isn't like Little House on the Prairie anymore, where it would take you half the day to get to Mankato, Minnesota. You could instantly get from Mankato to New Ulm in 25 minutes or 30 minutes. So roads and transportation changed a lot of things in terms of our social structures, our ability to find ideas from other communities, and our ability to see connections between towns that we hadn't seen before. During this time, there was also a mechanization of agriculture. We saw a good 30 to 50% decline in the number of farm workers across the countryside, and that was only promulgated more in the latter half of the century during farm consolidation. We started to see churches close. As towns became more secularized, you just didn't have the numbers. I mean, this is the fact of life as things change, and the secularization of our small towns has led to a lot of different social restructurings, which I'll talk about here in a bit. In the last half of the century, we dealt with Main Street restructurings. You see your grocery stores close. You see your retail places, your hardware stores close. You see school consolidations. This was huge in Minnesota, and I'm sure here too. We saw a decline of about 22% in the number of school districts in Minnesota between 1970 and about 2000, right in there. We saw hospitals close. We saw clinics close. Again, I would like to say that these dynamics were unique to rural, but they're not. Rural is changing, but so is America. Globalization, I'm sure you've all heard of it, has had its impact on rural areas and urban areas alike. So when a small town loses their grocery store, it's pretty apparent when your small town loses your grocery store. When you're in an urban area and you lose your grocery store, you got 4 or 5 others you can go to. It's not nearly as apparent. Small towns are the canary in the coal mine in terms of globalization. So these changes, again, are impacting a lot of places, but they're disproportionately attributed to the decline and the death of our small towns. So you go back and look at headlines. I do this all the time. Read newspapers from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and look at the headlines saying, you know, this church is closing in southwestern Minnesota. This small town is really taking the right turn into the ditch. Our clinics are closing. Our schools are closing. You hear the same mantra over and over again. How many towns have really shuttered up? In Minnesota, in the past 70 years, 3. Our small towns have been extremely resilient despite all of these changes to maintain themselves. And we do a budget analysis too across the state, and our small towns are holding fairly steady. They're pretty stable. Our school boards have done a fabulous job of retaining some sense of stability despite the decline in school enrollments. So while things have changed, there is no evidence out there that shows losing any single structure is actually going to cause the town to die off. And we see this, I mean, we just saw this a year ago with the post offices talking about post office closings, right? And you're seeing it here too. There was a headline in the paper that the demise is near. And there were quotes, I'm sure cherry-picked, from reporters that come out to our small towns and talk to somebody who says, and there's literally a quote, one of them that said, "The post office is the social hub of our community." No, I mean, post offices are important, but I'm sure it's not, you don't buy your coffee in your post office. You're doing nothing more than getting your mail, and you may cross paths. But don't tell me a small town is really going to be at risk for its future. Its economic, social vitality is at risk because of your post office. But this is the type of nuanced proclamations that are made about our small towns. And this bothers me, that we have all this. When I know the data, and what does this data show? We have been in the midst of a rural rebound for 30 of the past 40 years. People have been moving to rural America in record numbers. We have seen an 11% increase in the rural population in the United States since 1970. There's never been a higher rural population than right now. What you hear about, though, is the decline in the relative percentage of people living in rural communities. Used to be 50% of Americans lived in rural communities. Now that's down to 19%. And that number, that relative percentage, has gotten smaller each decade as they do the census. But what's happening is the urban growth rate is, say, 12%. The rural growth rate is 5%. That leads to a relative decline. So your pie is getting bigger, but the share of pie that's rural is getting smaller. That is what gets picked up on. So when the census came out for the 2000s, I was talking with Randy, and I talk to Randy all the time, we talk about this, that we look at newspaper articles. And there was one out of Lincoln that showed rural decline continues. So there are two pieces going on here. Not only is the relative percentage of people living rural declining, but you have formerly rural counties being moved into urban status, right? So what, Grand Island is a recent urban change. As a statistician, what happens to the mean of items when you remove the top end? So let's look at income in rural areas. And your income is calculated by all the people living in rural areas. Now, Grand Island is probably one of the more high income rural areas. It was, we'll say 10 or 20 years ago. Higher income rural, it's urban now. You remove the high income county, you lose its home values, you lose its income. Your mean for rural goes down whenever you take off the high end. Not everybody's income in rural areas all of a sudden went down 6% in the past decade, right? Your home values didn't all plummet by 6 to 10%. You just removed the top end of the data that calculated your mean. So you have to be very careful about how these statistics are used. And these are just some other numbers. Between 90 and 99, I haven't updated this yet, but really, and this is counterintuitive. People think rural area, again, is dying out. But between 90 and 99, 2.2 million more people moved from the city to the country than vice versa. Britain is well ahead of us in this respect. I mean, it's a total 180 there. People want to live in the countryside there, but they can't afford to. And there's a bunch of articles out of the Journal of Rural Studies that only the rich people live in the country. I mean, they've been landlocked for a lot longer than we have and had a population growth that leads to population density higher than we've got. This is the path we're going down. I use them as a template for how we interpret the changes we see. So does decline really mean decline? Mobility. Here's the first statistic. Now when I first started looking at data, this is one statistic that stood out to me, the Minnesota one here, obviously. When asked in 2000, so there used to be a question in the long form of the census that asked people, where did you live 5 years ago? And 43% of the people then lived in a different residence. In any 5-year period, 43% of all Minnesotans moved. This blew my mind. Like almost half the people moved. We are a very mobile society. Not today because of the mortgage crisis, but we'll talk about that. So, the answer to the second poll question, what percentage of Nebraskans move in a 3-year time period? It's 28%. 1 in 4 households. Now, it varies by age, of course. You get your younger kids who move out, and then people move at different points and different points in time. But it's very high. This presentation will be made available to you in case you want to see the slides I'm glossing over right now. But what I like to look at here is a very simplistic cohort model. So what I did initially, there was EDA Region 4 in Minnesota, which is 9 counties: Becker, Clay, Douglas, Grant, Ottertail, Pope, Stevens, Traverse, and Wilkin. And you may have only heard of one of them, Douglas County, where Alexandria, Minnesota is, which is is the biggest town in that region. And they asked me to do some demographic analysis. And I thought, you know, all we look at is the relative percentage of people in different age groups. So we used to have, 14% of people over the age of 65, and it went up to 28. Well, that tells you kind of broad categories, but it doesn't tell you what groups of people are deciding to do over time. And this is what a cohort analysis does. So let's say everybody's sitting at the table there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. And let's say 10 years ago, you were all 31 years old, right? Now, 10 years later, you will be 41. So what I want to compare here is the number that we observed 10 years ago, and use that as the number. If nobody ever moved, we would expect to have 5 people that were 41 years old 10 years later. Okay? If you don't get this right away, I'm going to have 2 more ways to show how this is. Okay, so this is the cohort. Just like, another way to show this is a kindergarten class in grade school. If you have 20 kindergarten kids, then next year you expect that same cohort to be 20 in first grade. And then move on to second grade, there's 20 there. That's a cohort. You're following a cohort. So I'm following this cohort that's 31 years old. And what I found was, can you see my cursor there? Yes. Okay, what I found was the blue bar is how many we expected to have in that cohort from 10 years ago. The red bar is how many we actually found in that cohort today. And I looked at this and thought, why are we seeing so many red bars exceeding the blue bars? There's more people here in the 35 to 39, 40 to 44, 45 to 49 age cohorts. Thousands of people more than we expected to have from 10 years ago. What also sticks out here is where the blue bar exceeds the red is where there's a loss of people in this cohort. So if this one is, say, 25 to 29, right here, this one is 25 to 29, in the year 2000, well, 10 years ago, they were 15 to 19, so there were a lot of high school kids. This is the so-called brain drain. So this is where the blue bar exceeds the red is losing people, but red bar exceeding the blue is gaining people in these age cohorts. So what we noticed was that there was gains in these 30 to 49 age cohorts, as well as in the 10 to 14 and 15 to 19. So it became apparent that we were getting these people moving in with their kids, right? Here's another way to show it. And this is just an example. I'll get some Nebraska data here in a second. Again, if you cannot see this, I'll encourage you to move up right now because you're going to see a lot of charts like this for counties that you live in. So what we have here, at the bottom are the age groups, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, in 5-year increments all the way up. I don't really look at the data above age 60 or so because death rates start to really take over in the data. But the important thing here to show is the bars indicate the difference between how many people we expected to have and how many we actually found. So here, first let's look at the red chart up here, and I use maroon and gold because that's the Gopher colors. Is Grant County is located in western Minnesota. Not a very large county at all, no retail trade center in the county. And when you ask people there, like, oh, we're pretty quiet, you know, nobody ever really comes and goes. Nobody ever comes and goes, but 43% of Minnesotans move in any 5-year period. Like, you've got to have somebody moving in and somebody moving out. So if you look there, this is their historical population from 1900 to 2000. And you see it was relatively flat. And really, their signs didn't change all that much. If there were, you know, you have the signs that show the population as you come into towns. If there was one coming into the county, it would be almost unchanged in a decade. But when we look inside of the data, you see losses and gains. You have gains in 30 to 34, 35 to 39. These are a couple hundred people moving in. And you know, as a small town guy, small numbers mean big things for our small towns. You get 6 people to move into your town a year in a town of 700 like Hancock where I live. That's a 16% popular, 10, 12% population gain. That's pretty good for a small town. So these numbers, even though they're not tens of thousands or things like that, I just want to say that when you're seeing 100 people in that age cohort move into Grant County, that's a pretty big win. Here's the brain drain. You see the kids leaving, right? They're losing 200 people. And I've got some charts here that show the percentage of your young people that leave. And it's pretty high. But we see these 30 to 49-year-olds moving in with their kids. And actually, so I first did some maps and some charts for Minnesota, and the reporters in Minnesota love it, and they start calling other states saying, oh, you know, North Dakota, is this going on there? And they're like, heck no, that's only in Minnesota. That's where they got all the lakes and the recreational areas. We see these gains even in southwestern Minnesota, the prairie of southwestern Minnesota, where you can watch storms come in for 3 or 4 hours until they hit your house. These are areas that we're still seeing overall population decline, but the population decline is dominated by the loss of the kids and the seniors. But we still see gains in these 30 to 50-year-olds moving into our small towns. So I produced the national maps. Here's the population change map from 2000 to 2010. This is the map everybody loves to look at because you're a winner if you gain people and you're a loser if you lose people, right? And this dictates your narrative. This is how you talk about your town. If you have to reduce the number of people on the sign outside of your town, it's a bummer. But what we do show is that even in light of all the decline, you look at the Great Plains states here from North Dakota, southwestern Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, up through the panhandle of Texas. But then you look at where do people 30 to 34 move into, and it's in all of these places that we see overall population decline. Just because you lost people overall does not mean you lose everyone. And this is the map for 2000 to 2010. Again, look at Nebraska. Compare your pop change map, which had pretty much growth around your urban centers, to the growth of your 30 to 34-year-olds. So again, here's your pop change for Nebraska. Here's 30 to 34-year-olds. You gained, your cohort of 30 to 34-year-olds grew by 25% or more in all of these counties in the 90s. Here's 35 to 39. The growth was still there, not as strong as in the 90s. 90s was the boom of this trend. Still happened in the 2000s, but it was slowed a bit. Here's 30 to 34 in the 2000s. Again, a lot of growth outside of pop decline counties, and 35 to 39-year-olds. So we have this term brain drain. Losing people in your rural community is the rule, not the exception. Too many towns, I'm sure some of you have read the Karen Kapalis book, The Hollowing Out the Middle, right? So I have my Google News alert, and I follow up with the communities that have heard their presentation and let them know it's not all doom and gloom. Just because you lose your kids doesn't mean you lose everyone. And I spit out their data for them. Tell them your cohort of 30 to 45-year-olds gained by 32%. This is an opportunity for rural communities. So in the 87 Nebraska counties that lost young people after graduation, 45% or just over half of your counties lost more than 50% of your young people. I mean, there are opportunities here to possibly keep more of them, but I will tell you from a social capital perspective, that's not what you want to encourage. Social capital perspective, especially bridging and linking capital, tells you want a consistent turnover of people in your community to bring in new ideas, to bring in kind of fresh blood, you'll see. Just 6 of the counties gained people in these younger cohorts, and these are metro counties. Or college counties, yes. All right, so here's some of your counties. Cheyenne. So does everybody understand how to look at this chart? Any clarifying questions at this point? Because there are going to be a bunch of these of your counties here. Right? All right, so you've got your brain drain, right? Loss of your 15 to 19, 20 to 24-year-olds, but you've got a gain. So it looks like here in Cheyenne, the population went up just a little bit. And what we show here is actually the people moving into the county outweighed the number of young people leaving. Brown County, North Central. Here you had a population decline that was driven mostly by the loss of your young people, and you did not have enough 30 to 40-year-olds coming in to make up for that loss. And again, they're bringing their kids. You always look at the 10 to 14-year-old age cohort down here. I mean, 10 to 14-year-olds don't migrate by themselves, right? They come with households. So, Garfield County, population gainer, strong growth, 30 on above, but again, they're losing their young people too. Hayes County, Southwest, non-panhandle, 72% gain in the 30 to 34 age cohort. Webster County, again, these aren't going to be huge numbers, but what this tells me is this is a trend. This isn't unique to 3 or 4 counties. This is across the board, just about. You still have some counties that don't experience it, but the number of counties that are experiencing gains in this cohort well exceeds the number that don't. If I remember right, it's 79% of the counties in the 90s that lost people overall gained people in these brain gain categories. And it's at 60% after the 2000s. Pawnee County, Southeast. Sioux County, Northwest. Now, I put 2 up here because you see they really, in the 90s, there were pretty significant gains, right? In these 30 to 40-year-olds, but it really declined out in the 2000s. And when I look at the data, I found out that you had an increase in that county of vacant homes, but they weren't vacant, they were recreational homes. So you had a lot of people buying up housing there that weren't living there anymore. Burt County, still seeing the gains, not as great. Douglas County. Where do the kids go? Right? Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, that's a snapshot at both ends of that decade, correct?
That's right. Yep. So here we see where the young people are attracted to. And this really isn't a surprise. So this is on the chart on the left is the 90s, on the chart on the right is the 2000s. What interests me, and this parallels like Hennepin and Ramsey County in the Twin Cities metro area, is that we hear all the time that people are all going to the big city. We have the same type, this is really what I call an urban demographic profile of this population change. They gain the young people, but that's about it. There are people everywhere above the age of 35, people start moving away from the core metro counties. They cannot hold on to people over the age of 30, 35, somewhere in there. Here's Lincoln. So big population gainer again, but that gain is really driven by your young people. So what is this trend? This growth is primarily in the 30 to 49 age group, and a lot of this in-migration in these specific age cohorts can make up for the loss of your out-migration. And the point I have here is, what if nobody ever came back? What if we didn't have these gains in 30 to 50-year-olds, 30 of the past 40 years? The models I've run show your populations would be anywhere between 10 to 28% lower than they are right now if you didn't have these people moving in. These people are bringing kids aged 10 to 17. I didn't include the slide here, but I do a slide of school enrollment looking at the same type of cohort analysis following the kindergarten to the first to the second grade. And what you see is it's fairly flat from kindergarten. Say there's 20 kids in kindergarten, 20 in first grade, 20 in second, 23, 25, 27. The cohorts get bigger in third, fourth, fifth, and sixth grades as the newcomers are bringing their kids in. School administrators love this. So really there's this big interchange going on between urban, rural, and suburban areas. And this interchange, as I mentioned, is necessary for the influx of new ideas. The counties that have experienced the greatest migration of people in and out of their communities have lower unemployment rates, they recover from recession quickly, they have higher incomes, higher education levels. So, Randy and Cheryl picked up my data and wrote a grant and got it, which is something I wish I would have done. But they brought me down because really what we showed was even in the Panhandle where you're experiencing anywhere between 8 to 15% population decline, there's still a gain in these 30 to 49-year-olds. So it was a matter of actually going out and finding all these newcomers, and they called it the Buffalo Commons Research. I'm sure you're familiar with the Popper and Popper article where it was a husband and wife team that talked about the infrastructure of our small towns is going to be too costly to keep up, water and sewer and the housing and you name it, and we just don't have the population base to kind of invigorate our small towns. So they wrote a paper hypothesizing that maybe we should just return the landscape to the buffalo. And they had to have armed guards protect them for a period of time because that is the power of words and people believing they're going to lose their homes. But this was a reality that they were at in terms of how much does it cost to keep our small towns going. So anyway, that's why it was called the Buffalo Commons. This was counter to everything that we learned about. And what surprised us even more is nobody really saw this before. This happened in the 70s. This happened all through the 90s. We didn't publish a thing until 2002. Was the first real recognition. There were some things out there called the rural rebound, but that was more about overall population gains. So you Google rural rebound or rural renaissance, and you'll see there was stuff written in 1981 talking about this huge population explosion in rural areas. So this grant went out and talked to newcomers and did surveys, focus groups. Top 3 reasons people gave as to why. Why did you come out here? Slower pace of life is number 1. Safety and security is number 2. Lower price of housing is number 3. In Minnesota, jobs wasn't even in the top 10. Quality of life is a huge trump card in this. Who were these people? 36% had lived in the community previously. I don't remember if this is my data or your data. I somehow forgot to put that. It's ours. So a third, which normally when I give this presentation, they're like, oh, our kids are coming back home. Well, a third of the newcomers were graduates from your area or had any close family in the area. Marketing people hate us for this because there is no general profile of the newcomer in these age demos other than age, 30 to 49. 36% lived there previously. 2/3 of the people really had no affiliation with the area before. It's like, oh, I went to Bible camp up by Alexandria when I was a kid. I always liked the area. So we kind of poked around there. These newcomers generally looked in a 45-mile radius, anywhere between 3 to 5 towns. Rural areas are our playground. No town is a one-stop shop. It hasn't been for a long time. I mean, I know a lot of rural people actually don't mind driving. Go to the restaurants in different towns. People live in one place, work in another, generally work within a 20 to 30-mile radius. We work in a 4-hour radius and extension, but people shop in a 45-mile radius and play in a 90-mile radius. We're in the middle of everywhere, wherever you are in rural areas. These people tend to be more educated than the resident population. They tend to have household incomes higher than the resident population. Just 51% had kids. We thought this was actually low. We thought a lot of people would be coming out with their families, you know. But actually just 51% of newcomers had children in their household. They were leaving their career. This is the real troublesome part, the real opportunity for economic development strategies. Is that you had people who, electrical engineers or book publishers, well, some of the book publishers actually kept their jobs. We had a lot of telecommuters, a lot of 1099ers, a lot of sole proprietors. But they were underemployed, and underemployed can mean two things. It can mean you want to work full-time, but you're working part-time, or you're educated to do one thing and you do another. Both of those were true. But really, quality of life was the trump card. So we had an engineer who did drawings for a company in the Twin Cities who told his boss, like, I'm moving to Watson, Minnesota. I mean, I'd love to keep my job with you. I don't know if there's a way that we can do this. Can we make this work? And the boss was, I don't know. I don't know. I've never had someone telecommute. Let's put you at half-time for 6 months, and then we'll revisit this. He moved out there and was so productive that after 6 weeks, he went back to full-time. So there's a lot of education to be done for business owners as to the benefits. There aren't all negatives. There are some, but it's really a management problem. It's not a workforce problem. In the future, overall, a lot said they would stay, but questions like this I'm very queasy about as a statistician because people can have the best of intentions and things don't. You know, you ask kids, like, do you want to live in your rural community in 10 years? And they're like, no, I don't think so. They don't know. I mean, what's an 18-year-old know? I mean, they know a lot of things, but do you know really where you're going to be in 10 years? I mean, much less 5. 5 might be a better window, but even so. So again, the percentage was lower for younger people. Those who rate their community as friendly and trusting generally have a higher percentage. So really this movement of people is consistent. It's not localized to a certain area. You look at the maps, it's all over the board. They're moving in their prime earning years. These people are in their prime earning years and making a choice to move out to rural America. This is really good news for us in rural areas. What we need to do is work more on engaging these people economically in viable occupations, either building upon their skill sets or finding connections to urban businesses. And I'll talk about that in a second. How am I doing on time? Can I get some sense of, I didn't bring my timekeeping. It's about up. And this goes till 10:45. Okay. The Pew Research study examined tens of thousands of Americans and asked them, where would you like to live? And we know right now that about 18% live in small towns and rural places, but their poll showed 51% of Americans would like to live in rural areas or small towns. People are moving all the time. Graduate from high school, you move. Meet a spouse, you move. You have a kid, you move. Change your jobs, you move. There are a lot of opportunities to capture newcomers in your small town. So really there is this national societal preference to live in what's called low density areas. This literature is just starting on this. So, you know, and this has been happening again since the 70s. Not everybody is leaving small towns, and really we're starting to find this new urbanity in small towns. This trend continued in the 2000s, albeit it was slowed. The price of fuel started to kick in 2006, the mortgage crisis in 2008, that kind of kept people where they were at. So that's why we're not seeing as strong of growth as we had before. But also, the 90s was a boon for the newcomers coming to our small towns, and they filled up a lot of our vacant properties. So this becomes an issue. But it also becomes an opportunity as baby boomers are going to be retiring and leaving their homes in the next 15 years. I really don't want to keep you over. Like I said, I'm trying to pack a lot in here. We can follow up with some of these strategies when we return and start the breakouts. Maybe that's the best thing to do at this point. We needed to hire a student. We hired an undergrad student, and our counties weren't all that big. We hired an undergrad to literally take our Info USA business list and verify they were all in the right place. Verify the phone numbers, the addresses, plus all of our community assets, the parks, the schools, things like that, so people could find them. We also have a relationship with Navtech, who provides the maps to our Garmin GPS devices and your different mapping services to also update those maps as well. Because housing was the #3 reason why people decided to move to a rural community, housing became a key factor in our economic development efforts. We identified houses that needed work and found contractors to help improve them when newcomers were interested in buying them. We provided housing alternatives. If people needed short-term housing, there were a lot of different housing aspects to the work. Provide a resource that allows potential newcomers to establish a personal connection to the region. So basically, it was a counselor, in a sense, that we attached to potential newcomers. This is a very different economic development strategy. This isn't industrial recruitment. This is a people attraction strategy that we work on. And this requires work. It requires you to talk to people that are interested in coming into the area, find out more about them, help them make a match to their community. And because we had such differential take rates at the local community place level, we worked with regional economic development agencies and our partners and our friends in the field there to really accomplish a lot of this work. We also engaged with real estate agents to identify newcomer motivations and reflections on the communities they visited. Real estate agents are on the front lines of the newcomer viewpoints. You may have to establish, like we did, confidential relationships with them because, number one, they don't want the other agents to know who they're working with or what homes they're really interested in. But it worked out very well. So we would get a log back from agents saying, here were the characteristics. There was a 2-person family that moved in, or a 3-person family that moved in. He's an electrician, she works in healthcare, and they want their kids to go in 3rd or 4th grade, hopefully with a Spanish program at middle school. Something as basic as that is a starting point. Employment strategies. Because we found so many newcomers that were underemployed, we started to make phone calls to metropolitan-based businesses that were allowing their employees to work in our rural communities. Just because a metropolitan business doesn't have a brick and mortar presence in your town doesn't mean your business doesn't have a presence in your town. When you've got people working for a business, and there is a trend of 1099ers, and these are people who are self-employed proprietors, and the 1099ers really work on contract year to year. 13% of the American workforce are 1099ers right now, and that number is only going up. Yep, these are people who are hired for short-term contracts. It could be a 1-year, it could be a 3-month, to accomplish certain goals for an organization. So say somebody wants a financial review of a certain arm of their business. They can have a contractor come in, do the analysis, write up a report, and they're done, and they move on to the next job. This is very attractive from the business management point of view because your HR costs are near nil. You're not worrying about taking out taxes, taking care of health care. I mean, your overhead is extremely low, and it gives you the ability to be a very flexible business in terms of changing products or services that you offer. So that's one thing, really actually making the phone calls to find out which businesses are doing that. Identify and build upon these auxiliary skills. So this is to the notion that people are trained in one thing and doing another. And this is a very difficult one to do because in a way you're cannibalizing your existing employers. So say Bob is working for Jim, but Bob has and he's helping at an implement dealer or working there, but really Bob is a good electrical engineer. Maybe you can help Bob build a business around the electrical engineering in the region or a connection to a metro place. But in a sense, you're going to have to tell Jim, like, we're going to take Bob away from your business here. So this is kind of a difficult issue to straddle there. And business succession planning. There's so much depth to this research that I didn't even touch on here today. But one thing I want to leave you with is these folks are extremely independent and extremely entrepreneurial. They were business owners, they were business proprietors, they were 1099ers at much higher rates than the resident population. Almost a quarter of these employees had some relationship to being a proprietor, a business owner, or bought a business that lived there, or that existed there. So there was one couple, for example, it was a farm couple, or he wanted to get into farming. So he got into farming with a colleague of his in the region, and she wanted something to do, and they looked around town and the flower shop was for sale. So in our interviews, we're like, well, what if it was a hardware store? Oh, we would have bought that then. There is nobody more invested in your community than a small business owner. So these types of newcomers do require that business succession planning. I'm sure those of you that do business development know it's a very tricky area to get involved with. So the key of all our strategies are surrounding people and not places. It's a very controversial statement, but we are an independent society. We are moving more so to becoming more independent. So I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to touch on civic life in rural areas are not dying either. These newcomers are coming in and starting nonprofits like crazy. In Minnesota, and I haven't gotten the data together with Randy yet, but in the counties in Minnesota that lost 5% of our population, there's still a 9% gain in the number of nonprofits. So there's this kind of going on, where even in declining populations, there's more nonprofits. This is a huge leadership issue. This, for me, allows us to identify counties that are experiencing leadership stress. And stress means your number of nonprofits is exceeding the number of people and has exceeded at a rate higher than the state norm, or we define that kind of cutoff differently. But people are active civically, but they're not involved in, maybe I'm bypassing all your stuff. There's one map here. This shows how many people in your town need to be involved in our nonprofit groups in a leadership position. I'm talking positional leaders. So if every nonprofit group in town needed 3 people, a president, vice president, and secretary/treasurer, how many people does that group have to tap into, or that organization have to tap into, to look for these leaders? So the organizations demand leaders, and people supply that leadership. And what you find, in the metropolitan counties, 1 in 55 people have to serve in a leadership position. Yes, and this includes government appointed and elected positions. 1 in 42. But when you start looking at the rural areas and out in the Western Panhandle, if all you're doing is attending the chamber board meetings and city councils, you're not even seeing the newcomers. Because they're involved in new types of groups. And so this is the last piece I'm going to leave you with. The broad sociological change that has occurred with regards to civic involvement is this. Historically, people have been involved in place-based groups that had a wide focus and a narrow geography. So the Hancock Community Betterment Club. We used to do everything from putting park equipment up to working with a school to getting the senior center put together. It was a very narrow geography, but a wide focus. Today, people want to be in groups that have a very narrow focus, that cover a wide geography, and have very diverse social interests. The West Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association. Very narrow, but you need that kind of wide geography. These are where the newcomers are involved. So I hear all the time, oh, those newcomers, they don't want to be involved in our groups. Well, you're right, if all you're talking about are the groups that are the historical groups, where and I stated the story, when I moved to Hancock first, I got a visit from one of the guys from the Lions that said, do you want to join the Lions? And what do you do? What do you want? You don't know anything about me, but you're trying to grab me. So this is one that I'm very careful about how we deal with. It is hard to find newcomers if you don't get out and start beating the streets. When our group first started doing our surveys and focus groups, we thought maybe we'd get a list of 60 or 70 people in 5 counties. We ended up with a list of 600 in 2 weeks. It took work, but they're there. And the #1 strategy I have is get your chamber to host a newcomer meeting. You're not doing anything but letting the newcomers get to know each other. There is no, I want you in our group, I want you in our group. Do you want to donate to our group? Put all that aside. Let the newcomers build their own social structures. So, hopefully, and this is extremely brief, I gave you some evidence to show that the rural narrative is not what it used to be. This isn't your grandpa's rural anymore, and hasn't been for almost a half a century. I don't know anything about rural decline. Since I started doing my work, I've seen nothing but rural growth. So having this conversation has been very difficult for me to learn how to not ruffle any feathers. I still do, because I just use the data to paint the story and use the sociological literature to tell me what is happening. So hopefully I gave you some evidence to help you retell your story and to retell this story in your communities. Because if our communities continue to use the deficit language describing their towns, they're going to turn off not only their kids, but the people who are deciding to move in. So, how can you contribute to the story? And this is where we are leaving my presentation.